By the spring of 1904, the area of land known as Forest Park on the western edge of St. Louis, Missouri had ceased, for practical purposes, to exist as a public park. The paths and meadows and drainage creeks that had served as a municipal green space since 1876 were, by that point, buried under approximately 1,372 acres of exhibition grounds, paved, graded, and sealed behind ticket gates. And what had replaced them was something that the city of St. Louis had been constructing with great expense and occasional desperation for the better part of 3 years. The sounds in those final weeks before opening were the sounds of finishing work. The drawl of a brush across plaster, the tap of carpenters seating the last decorative trim, the low, steady hum of electrical cables being threaded through conduit beneath the floors of buildings designed to resemble, from the outside, the permanent stone architecture of Rome or Vienna, but made almost entirely from a composite material called staff, a mixture of plaster, cement, jute fiber, and glycerin that, dried hard and white and aged poorly. The air through Forest Park in April sits at the boundary between the last of Missouri's winter reluctance and the first of its summer wait. Mornings cool enough to require a jacket, afternoons warm enough to collect perspiration at the collar, and carrying to the middle hours a particular smell of mass construction, sawdust, wet plaster, coal smoke from generators that had been running continuously for weeks. In the early hours, the low horizontal light of an April morning moved across those pale facades, giving the whole site a quality somewhere between grandeur and incompletion. If this kind of measured, unhurried history is the sort of thing that helps settle the mind toward the end of an evening, the subscribe button is there whenever the moment feels right. There is no rush here. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition was scheduled to open on the 30th of April, 1904, exactly 101 years after the transaction. It was meant to celebrate, and the fact that it was arriving a full year later than originally planned was, in the quiet way of such things, an early signal of the difficulties that had already accumulated and of those still to come. The Louisiana Purchase itself, the transaction that the fair was built to commemorate, had been conducted in the spring of 1803, when President Thomas Jefferson's envoys Robert Roswell Livingston and James Monroe negotiated with Napoleon Bonaparte's finance minister François de Barbarois in Paris for the transfer of approximately 828,000 square miles of North American territory, an area that would eventually become all or part of 15 American states, for the agreed sum of $15 million, or approximately 3 cents per acre at the calculation used most commonly at the time. The documents formalizing the transaction were signed on the 30th of April, 1803, and the effect of that transaction, beyond its immediate political and geographic consequences, was to situate the city of St. Louis at what would become the commercial and geographic center of an enormously expanded American republic. St. Louis had existed since the 1760s as a fur trading settlement at the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, a position that gave it, through much of the early 19th century, a practical dominance over the movement of goods and people into the North American interior that no other city on the continent could fully replicate. That dominance had made St. Louis, by the middle of the 19th century, one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the United States, and had created among the city's commercial and civic leadership a settled assumption that the city's future would be proportional to its past. By the 1880s and 1890s, however, that assumption was meeting sustained pressure from a set of economic realities that the city's leadership found difficult to fully absorb. Chicago had grown, in the decades following the Civil War, at a rate that had turned it from a secondary regional city into the commercial capital of the American interior, and the railway networks that had driven that growth had reorganized the geography of American commerce in ways that diminished rather than amplified St. Louis's position at the river confluence. By 1890, Chicago's population exceeded 1 million, while St. Louis stood at approximately 451,000, a gap that had been, a generation earlier, considerably narrower. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, which Chicago hosted on the reclaimed lakefront of Jackson Park to mark the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas, had then administered what felt, in St. Louis, like a particular kind of civic injury. Daniel Hudson Burnham's White City, 690 acres of neoclassical exhibition palaces, artificial waterways, and electrical illumination, had attracted approximately 27.5 million visitors over its 6-month run, generated sustained international coverage, and established Chicago's cultural and commercial ambitions in terms that had no rival in American civic life. Frederick Law Olmsted Sr., who served as the exposition's landscape architect, had written afterward that the Chicago Fair represented a unique convergence of American organizational will and artistic vision, and the city had accepted that assessment with the confidence of a place that had long since decided it was the country's second city in name only. The idea of a Louisiana Purchase Centennial Exposition in St. Louis emerged in this context in the late 1890s as a response that was simultaneously commemorative and competitive. The centennial offered pretext that Chicago had not possessed and could not replicate, a genuinely historical occasion, grounded in the specific geography of St. Louis, that will provide a reason for the world to come to Missouri rather than Illinois. The initial organizing committee, which began meeting in earnest in 1898 and 1899, included some of the city's most prominent commercial figures, among them Rollo Wells, who would later serve as mayor of St. Louis, and several members of the Merchants Exchange and the St. Louis Grain Exchange, whose businesses had a direct financial interest in the city's international visibility. The committee was frank in its internal communications about the competitive dimension of the project. The exposition would need to be larger than Chicago's in every measurable respect. More acreage, more buildings, more exhibits, more nations represented, or it would risk being perceived in the national and international press as a diminished imitation of what had already been done. That requirement, established in the planning rooms before a single shovel of earth had been turned, set the project on a trajectory toward costs that its initial budgets were not designed to carry. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition Company was formally incorporated in January of 1900, and David Rowland Francis was selected as its president. Francis had been born in Kentucky in 1850, was educated at Washington University in St. Louis, and had built a substantial fortune in the grain trade before entering public life as mayor of St. Louis in 1885, governor of Missouri from 1889 to 1893, and secretary of the Interior under President Grover Cleveland from 1896 to 1897. He was, at the time of the company's incorporation, 49 years old, experienced enough to understand the institutional mechanisms of large-scale public projects, connected enough in Washington to pursue federal funding through the appropriate channels, and committed enough to the idea of the exposition to absorb, over the next 4 years, a level of administrative and political difficulty that would have persuaded a less determined man to abandon the project altogether. Francis's leading collaborator in the organizational work was Halsey Cooley Ives, who served as director of the Department of Art and who had previously served in the same capacity at the 1893 Chicago Fair, bringing to St. Louis an institutional memory of how a World's Fair art program was organized and what its logistical demands actually looked like in practice. Frederick James Vincent Skiff, who served as director of exhibits, had also worked at Chicago, and the presence of these figures who had direct experience of the earlier fair gave the St. Louis organization a competence it might otherwise have had to develop from first principles. The central financial challenge was a familiar one for projects of this kind and this scale. The cost of construction was beyond what any private consortium could absorb without public support, and the organizers had understood from the beginning that federal participation would be essential. Francis and his associates conducted a sustained lobbying effort in Washington through 1900 and 1901, appearing before congressional committees, and meeting with members of both chambers and with officials of the McKinley administration argued that the centennial of the Louisiana Purchase was a national occasion whose significance justified national investment. Congress accepted the argument in principle, and the act creating the United States Louisiana Purchase Exposition Commission, signed into law in March of 1901, authorized a federal subscription of $5 million in exposition stock, releasing those funds in tranches conditional on the exposition company raising matching capital from state and private sources. Missouri state legislature, responding to pressure from Francis and from St. Louis's congressional delegation, appropriated $5 million from state funds. The city of St. Louis issued municipal bonds valued at $5 million more. Private subscription campaigns organized by the Exposition Company's board raised additional millions in working capital from the city's commercial community. And by the time the financial architecture of the project was fully assembled, the total authorized capital had reached approximately $19.5 million, a figure that seemed, in the planning rooms of 1901 and 1902, to be sufficient for the task that had been defined. It was not sufficient. The final cost of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, accounting for all construction, all operations, all administrative expenses, all exhibits, and all infrastructure improvements to the surrounding area necessitated by the fair's demands on the city's transportation and utilities networks, settled at approximately $31.5 million, a figure that exceeded the original authorized capital by more than 60%. The gap between projected and actual costs was not, in any simple sense, the product of mismanagement or corruption, though both were alleged at various points in the exposition's history. It was more precisely the consequence of an initial scale decision that had been made on competitive rather than budgetary grounds. The exposition's physical footprint: 1,372 acres, 1,500 distinct structures, 11 major exhibition palaces, each covering between 3 and 7 acres of floor space, had been established to exceed Chicago, and the cost of achieving that excess was, in the nature of things, larger than what a budget derived from Chicago's figures with Sugg St. Isaac Taylor. The chief of construction managed this gap through a continuous process of value engineering that was legible in the results. Workers were hired at the lowest available rates. Materials were purchased in quantities that maximized volume discounts at the expense of quality and construction. Timeline was compressed at the cost of working conditions that, by 1903, had become a source of complaint in the St. Louis labor press. The physical material from which most of the exposition's buildings were constructed was a composite known as staff, a substance that had been used in World's Fair construction since at least the 1889 Paris Exposition Universelle, and that the Chicago White City had employed to its distinctive visual effect. Staff was made by combining Portland cement with plaster of Paris, glycerin, and jute or hemp fiber in proportions that vary depending on the specific application, and the result, when applied over a framework of timber and wire lath, dried to a hard, smooth, brilliant white surface that could be carved and molded to reproduce the details of classical stonework at a fraction of the cost and weight of the actual material. It was, in its way, a remarkable substance, capable of producing, from a distance and in photographs, the impression of permanent monumental architecture using materials that were, in fact, temporary, fragile and sustained moisture, and designed to be demolished. The buildings of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition were built to look like civilization's permanent record of itself, while being engineered, from the first nail, for eventual destruction. That quality, the meticulous construction of something designed to disappear, was not incidental to the fair's character. It was foundational to it, and it extended beyond the buildings to the experiences and representations the buildings contained. The construction workforce that built those staff palaces across the years 1901 to 1904 numbered, at its peak, approximately 12,000 laborers working simultaneously across the site. They came from St. Louis's established working-class neighborhoods, Soulard, Dutchtown, the Carey Patch District, and from the pool of more recent arrivals who had migrated to the city from southern and eastern Europe in the preceding decade. Polish, Italian, Czech, and Slovak workers who had settled in the streets immediately adjacent to Forest Park and who represented, in the labor market of 1903 and 1904, the most cost-effective available workforce for construction labor of this kind. Skilled trades, carpentry, electrical work, decorative plastering, earned wages at the upper end of the range, between $1.75 and $2.25 per day. Unskilled laborers on grading and foundation work earned toward the lower end, between $1 and $1.25 per day. The work was seasonal in the sense that outdoor construction slowed during Missouri's winters, but the interior finishing work that dominated the final year of construction required continuous labor regardless of season, and the compressed timeline of the final push before the April opening date of 1904 created conditions of sustained physical pressure on the workforce that are documented in the contemporary issues of the St. Louis Labor Tribune and in the records of the building. Trades Council of St. Louis. The Exposition Company was not, by the standards of its time, an unusually harsh employer. It was, rather, an entirely typical one, operated within the norms of an era in which construction labor was understood as an expendable input to be minimized rather than a human cost to be carefully managed. The question of when a fair would open had become contentious well before the decision was formally made to delay it. The original target date of 1903 had been announced publicly by the Exposition Company with confidence in 1901, and a significant portion of the organizational work, the solicitation of international exhibits, the commissioning of architects, the negotiation of concession contracts, had proceeded on the assumption that the centennial year deadline was firm. By the middle of 1901, the construction program was running behind schedule on every major building simultaneously, and Frederick James Vincent Skiff's exhibit procurement team was reporting from their negotiations with European governments that the diplomatic timelines required to secure major national exhibits from France, Germany, Great Britain, and the other leading participating nations were longer than the original schedule had assumed. David Rowland Francis faced a decision with a combination of reluctance and pragmatism. The organizational case for a delay was overwhelming, but the public case required managing perception that the event's organizers had promised something they could not deliver. Francis traveled to Washington in the fall of 1901, shortly after the assassination of President William McKinley and the assumption of the presidency by Theodore Roosevelt, and presented the situation to the Roosevelt administration with the request that the centennial date be formally extended. Congress authorized a delay in the spring of 1902, and the Louisiana Purchase Exposition was rescheduled to open on the 30th of April, 1904, exactly 101 years after the documents in Paris had been signed. The public messaging around the delay was careful and largely successful in limiting damage to the exposition's reputation. The exposition company's official communications presented the additional year as an opportunity for greater completeness, for a more comprehensive gathering of exhibits, a more fully realized physical environment, and a more ambitious program of international participation than would have been possible under the original timeline. Theodore Roosevelt, whose administration had a political interest in the fair's success as a demonstration of American organizational capacity, maintained his public support and agreed to appear at the opening ceremonies, though his schedule ultimately required him to send his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, in his place. The foreign diplomatic community, which had its own reasons to maintain cordial relations with the Roosevelt government, accepted the revised schedule without significant complaint. And the city of St. Louis, whose residents had been living adjacent to a construction site of remarkable scale and noise for the better part of 2 years, found in the delay the somewhat cold consolation that the thing they had been living next to would eventually be finished. What the promotional literature of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition communicated, consistently and at length, was the idea that the fair represented a universal gathering, a presentation, in one place, in one organized context, of the full range of human achievement in the arts, the industries, and the sciences of the modern world. Frederick James Vincent Skiff, writing in the exposition's official yearbook for 1902, described the event as a place where the visitor could understand, through direct encounter with the exhibits, the full trajectory of human progress from its earliest forms to its contemporary achievements. The word universal, which appeared in that literature with notable frequency, carried in the formal language of world's fair classification a specific technical meaning. It designated an exposition open to exhibits from all nations, as distinct from more specialized or regional fairs. But the word also carried a philosophical resonance, an implication of comprehensiveness, of genuine inclusiveness, of an honest accounting of what humanity in 1904 had made and done and become, that the fair's actual organizational decisions would, in the months following its opening, complicate in ways that its planners had not fully anticipated, and that its visitors would encounter, without always recognizing them as complications at all. The physical layout of the fairgrounds, with the palaces of industry and technology arranged at the ceremonial center and the exhibits of anthropology and indigenous peoples arranged at the periphery, was not accidental. It was a deliberate spatial argument about the world, encoded in plaster and geography, and it was waiting for 20 million people to walk through it. The fair ceremonial opening took place on the 30th of April, 1904, in weather that the St. Louis Post-Dispatch described the following morning as fair and mild, with temperatures reaching approximately 62 degrees Fahrenheit in the afternoon. William Howard Taft delivered the formal address in President Roosevelt's absence, and David Rowland Francis presided over a ceremony that drew a crowd the exposition company estimated at approximately 187,000 people, a figure that was in all likelihood somewhat generous, but that conveyed accurately enough the scale of public interest in an event that had been building, in the public's awareness, for the better part of 4 years. Festival Hall's great organ, one of the largest pipe organs ever assembled to that point, played across the Grand Basin, and the cascade of water down the hillside in front of the hall caught the afternoon light with a particular quality that the designers had intended: monumental, calm, and very white. The people in that crowd had come from across Missouri, from neighboring states, and from cities as distant as New York and San Francisco, and most of them were seeing for the first time a physical environment that looked, from the Esplanade, exactly as the promotional lithographs had promised it would look. What the lithographs had not shown, because it was not the kind of thing that lithographs were designed to show, was what it had cost to put it there. The approach to the Louisiana Purchase Exposition's main entrance along de Balavier Avenue on the southern edge of the fairgrounds gave a visitor their first encounter with the visual argument the fair was making about itself. The main exhibition palaces were large enough that their roof lines were visible from well outside the gates, pale against the Missouri sky, elaborately detailed at their cornices and pediments with carved allegorical figures and classical ornament, and arranged at intervals that suggested the broad avenues of a European capital rather than comparatively compressed grid of working St. Louis. The first impression was of permanence. This was a deliberate result. Every aspect of the fair's architectural vocabulary, the proportion of column to entablature, the hierarchy of dome and colonnaded wing and forecourt, the brightness of the staff facades against the summer green of Forest Park, had been calibrated to communicate solidity, duration, and the settled confidence of civilization that had arrived at a stable form, and was now presenting that form for collective inspection. The material reality beneath that impression was something considerably less durable. Staff, the composite substance from which nearly all the fair's major buildings were constructed, had been used in world's fair construction since at least the 1889 Paris Exposition Universelle, and had been employed to its most celebrated effect in the Chicago White City of 1893. Its composition varied by application, but in its most common form combined Portland cement, plaster of Paris, glycerin, and jute fiber in proportions that produced, when applied over a framework of timber lath and iron wire, a hard, smooth, white surface that could be molded or carved to reproduce the ornamental detail of classical stonework at a fraction of the cost and weight of actual stone. Staff was also hygroscopic. It absorbed atmospheric moisture readily and continuously, and its structural integrity under specific conditions of Missouri's climate, with its combination of humid summers, wet springs, and freezing winters, was limited enough that the organizing committee had understood from the beginning that demolition was the only practical disposition for the exposition's buildings after the fair closed. A staff structure left standing through a Missouri freeze-thaw cycle would not survive the experience intact, and the cost of maintaining those buildings against progressive moisture damage over a period of even 2 or 3 years would have exceeded the cost of their original construction. The buildings were, in this precise technical sense, designed to be destroyed. Their grandeur was a scheduled condition. Emmanuel Louis Masqueret, the French-born architect who served as the exposition's director of design, was responsible for the visual coherence of fairgrounds and for the design of its most symbolically prominent building, Festival Hall. Masqueret had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris during the 1870s and 80s before emigrating to the United States, where he had worked first in the office of Richard Morris Hunt in New York and then established his own practice. The architectural vocabulary he brought to St. Louis was the one he had absorbed across those years of Parisian formation. The Grand Dome as an organizing summit, the colonnaded wing as a gesture of civic embrace, the forecourt and its water features as a space of mediated transition between the ordinary world and the institutional one. Festival Hall, positioned at the western head of the Grand Basin, and visible from nearly every major avenue of the fairgrounds, was the most expensive single structure the exposition constructed, and contained within its dome what was widely regarded, at the time of its completion, as the largest pipe organ in the world. An instrument built by the Los Angeles Art Organ Company with approximately 10,000 pipes of varying diameter, ranging from the width of a finger to the circumference of a rain barrel, requiring a dedicated electrical generator to power its bellows continuously during performances. The organ concerts held in Festival Hall throughout the fair's operational period drew audiences of several thousand on most evenings, and the instrument was, by the assessment of music critics who covered the fair for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and the St. Louis Globe-Democrat, genuinely and significantly accomplished, a legitimate cultural achievement embedded within an architecture that was materially incapable of lasting beyond the season. Masqueret went on, in the years following the fair's close, to design the Cathedral of St. Paul in Minnesota, where his command of the Baroque ecclesiastical tradition found a permanent material expression that his St. Louis work, for structural reasons, could never have provided. Descending from the terrace before Festival Hall was the Cascades, a sequence of 12 broad terrace-reflecting pools connected by channels through which water was pumped continuously during the fair's operational hours, descending in controlled sheets and falls toward the Grand Basin below. The engineering of the Cascades required a dedicated pumping station of considerable capacity, and its construction added to the exposition's costs in ways that the early budgets had not fully projected. The Grand Basin itself, an artificial lake approximately 1,000 feet in length positioned at the center of the fairground's main axis, served both as a visual terminus of the central esplanade and as a reflective surface that doubled the height and scale of the surrounding palaces in the still water on calm mornings. The gondoliers who worked the decorative boats on the Grand Basin during operating hours were among the 7,000 employees the exposition company maintained on daily payroll throughout the fair's run, a workforce that, when added to the vendors, concessionaires, demonstrators, exhibit attendants, and security personnel operating simultaneously across the grounds, represented an ongoing operational labor expenditure that the exposition company managed with the same cost minimizing pressure it had applied during the construction phase. The electrical system that illuminated the grounds after dark was, in terms of its novelty for most fairgoers, among the most discussed features of the entire exposition. Approximately 1,500 miles of electrical wire had been laid beneath and around the fairgrounds during the construction period, supplying current to more than 200,000 incandescent lamps mounted on the building's facades, along the esplanades, around the Grand Basin, and within the colonnades and porticos of the major palaces. The generating capacity required to power this system simultaneously was supplied by a central power plant constructed specifically for the exposition, connected to the main electrical lines by a dedicated distribution network that had no relation to the municipal electrical infrastructure of St. Louis, which in 1904 still served only portions of the city and at a scale insufficient for the fair's demands. The effect at nightfall, when the system was switched on from the central control station in a single coordinated action, produced a transition from a large and visually impressive daytime exhibition ground to something that had no ready equivalent in the experience of most of its visitors. The technology of coordinated large-scale electrical illumination was not, by 1904, entirely new. The 1893 Chicago Fair had demonstrated on a significant scale more than a decade earlier, but remained, for the great majority of American fairgoers, a technology that existed in their daily lives only at the domestic scale of a single lamp in a single room, and the leap from that intimate scale to the illumination of 1,372 acres in a single instant was genuinely and measurably striking. Nighttime attendance at the exposition was consistently higher per dollar of operational expenditure than daytime attendance, and the electrical display was identified in visitor surveys and newspaper correspondence columns as the single most frequently cited memorable experience of the fair. The 11 main exhibition palaces that occupied the esplanade and its surrounding avenues were organized thematically according to the categories of human activity that the exposition's planning committee had determined were most representative of civilizational progress. The Palace of Transportation, one of the physically largest enclosed structures on the grounds, housed exhibits ranging from horse-drawn carriages to early internal combustion automobiles, including a display of vehicles from the Oldsmobile Motor Works of Lansing, Michigan, which had begun producing its curved-runabout model in 1901, to railway locomotives, steam-powered agricultural equipment, and maritime navigation instruments. The Palace of Electricity contained working demonstrations of telegraph and telephone apparatus, early radio transmission equipment developed from the principles established by Guglielmo Marconi, and electric motors and generating systems that were, by 1904, beginning to transform production floors of American industry. The Palace of Liberal Arts, positioned near the central axis of the fairgrounds, housed exhibits from universities, learned societies, and scientific institutions from across the United States and from approximately 54 nations, and contained within its galleries a collection of books, manuscripts, scientific instruments, and educational materials that came closer, in its organization and intention, to the academic ideals of the fair's promotional literature than almost any other section of the grounds. Halsey Cooley Ives, the director of the Department of Art, spent the years 1901 to 1904 in active correspondence with the art institutions of Europe and North America, soliciting loans of significant works for the fine arts galleries. And the collection eventually assembled in Cass Gilbert's Palace of Fine Arts was the largest single gathering of artworks in American fair history to that point. The Palace of Fine Arts occupied a position slightly removed from the main esplanade, at the northern edge of the fairgrounds, and its material difference from the surrounding buildings was apparent to any visitor who looked closely enough at its construction. Cass Gilbert had designed it in reinforced concrete and brick, faced with limestone quarried in Indiana, with the explicit intention from the outset that it would remain after the fair's close as a permanent public art museum for the city of St. Louis. Gilbert had been born in Zanesville, Ohio, in 1859, had trained at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and had worked in the office of McKim, Mead, and White in New York before establishing his own practice in St. Paul, Minnesota. The Minnesota State Capitol, completed in 1905, was a project that had established his national reputation for large-scale institutional design in the Beaux-Arts tradition, and the St. Louis Commission represented a similar scale of civic permanence, a building designed not to look permanent, but actually to be so. The contrast with its neighbors was, for anyone who understood what the surrounding buildings were made of, a kind of architectural candor. Here was one building at the Louisiana Purchase Exposition that meant precisely what it looked like, and the St. Louis Art Museum that occupies that structure today stands as among the most durable artifacts of the entire enterprise. The Pike, which ran through a central section of the fairgrounds along a route approximately 1 mile in length, was organized around a different architectural logic entirely. Where the main exhibition palaces spoke the civic vocabulary of columns, pediments, and allegorical program, the Pike's commercial entertainment buildings operated in the vernacular of temporary showmanship, built of the same staff material as the palaces, but dressed in painted signs, electric light displays, and the dense visual noise of competitive commerce. Approximately 50 individual entertainment venues were arranged along the Pike's length during the fair's operational period, their character ranging from the theatrical to the quasi-educational. The Boer War exhibit employed live performers, pyrotechnic effects, and theatrical machinery to reenact engagements from the South African conflict that had concluded only 2 years earlier. The streets of Cairo offered a recreated North African streetscape with costume performers, food vendors, and camel rides that had been a popular feature at American fairs since the 1893 Chicago Exposition had introduced the format. The Galveston flood exhibit used scale models, pumped water, and theatrical lighting to reconstruct the catastrophic hurricane of 1900 that had killed between 6,000 and 12,000 people along the Texas coast, an event recent enough that many of the fair's visitors had read about it in the newspapers at the time it occurred. The creation exhibit purported to illustrate the biblical account of the world's origin through a combination of mechanical spectacle and painted backdrop, and charged 25 cents per adult for admission, a sum that several thousand visitors per day evidently found acceptable. Frederick Douglason Thompson, who operated the Dundee and Thompson shows in New York's Coney Island and who held a concession for several Pike attractions, later described the Pike as the most profitable single entertainment concession I have ever operated, a characterization that, while self-interested, was consistent with the revenue figures recorded in the exposition's concessionaire accounts. The admission structure of the fair layered commercial pressure onto visitors at multiple points in their experience of the grounds. The base gate admission of 50 cents per adult, 25 cents for children under 12, covered entry to the fairgrounds and to the main exhibition palaces. The Pike's individual venues charged their own additional fees. A visitor who attended 3 or 4 Pike attractions in the course of a single day would spend, on those entertainment alone, approximately the same amount as the original gate fee. Refreshment vendors operating inside the fairgrounds did so under concessionaire agreements with the exposition company that required percentage of gross revenue to be paid to the fair, and the pricing of food and beverages reflected both the cost of those agreements and the captive market conditions that prevailed inside a sealed exhibition ground from which no visitor could depart in search of less expensive alternatives without forfeiting their admission entirely. A ham sandwich at a fairgrounds lunch counter cost approximately 15 cents in the summer of 1904, at a time when the same item could be purchased from a delicatessen in one of St. Louis's working-class neighborhoods for 5 cents. The difference was partly the concession cost, partly the operational expense of feeding tens of thousands of people in an improvised catering environment, and partly the elementary commercial logic of a market without external competition. Beyond the main palaces and the pike, the fairgrounds contain several additional categories of buildings whose existence is sometimes overlooked in the summary accounts of the exposition. Each of the 43 American states that participated in the fair was provided a plot of land on which to construct its own state building, a structure typically housing the state's official exhibits, a reception room for visiting dignitaries and state officials, and a lounge available to the state's residents who attended the fair. These state buildings, arranged in a section of the grounds somewhat removed from the main esplanade, were built at individual state expense and to individual state specifications, and they ranged in scale and ambition from Virginia Building, a replica of the Mount Vernon Plantation House, constructed in wood and plaster, to the Illinois Building, a substantial structure designed in the style of an Illinois courthouse, to several smaller state buildings that occupied little more than a comfortable parlor and a display case. The foreign government buildings, similarly arranged in their own district of the fairgrounds, house the national exhibits of participating countries, exhibits that had required, in most cases, diplomatic correspondence extending back to 1901 and 1902, the shipment of objects by ocean freight from ports in Europe, Asia, and South America, and the stationing in St. Louis of official government commissioners responsible for their installation, maintenance, and eventual repatriation. The presence of those commissioners in the city through the fair's 7-month run added a layer of international social life to St. Louis that the city's hotels and clubs and restaurants found profitable, and the St. Louis Republic Society pages ran regular coverage of the dinners and receptions held in the various national buildings throughout the summer and autumn of 1904. The gap between the exposition's architectural self-presentation and the conditions under which that architecture had been produced was most apparent not in any single building or any single decision, but in the aggregate texture of an enterprise organized at every level around the principle that the surface of the thing was its operative reality. The staff buildings photographed as stone. The photographs were reproduced in newspapers and promotional catalogs. The newspapers and catalogs were read by people who formed their idea of the fair from the photographs and attended on the basis of that idea. The workers who had mixed the staff and applied it to the timber frames and trimmed its ornamental details received wages at the lowest rates the construction labor market would bear, worked under conditions that the state of Missouri's nascent labor regulations did not effectively reach, and were not acknowledged in the promotional literature that advertised the results of their labor as evidence of American civilization. The Pike's entertainment offered, for a modest additional fee, the pleasure of looking at people whose lives were being presented as objects of curiosity, a transaction whose commercial nature was clearly understood by everyone involved in it. The food vendors charged 3 times the street price for items whose preparation cost the same in either location. In each of these instances, the visible surface of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition was a thing that circulated in public culture, while the arrangements that made that surface possible receded behind it in the way that such arrangements always do, persistent and structural, and almost entirely invisible to the 20 million people who came to Forest Park to see what American civilization looked like at its moment of fullest confidence. The fair's architecture was the most complete expression of that dynamic. Buildings of great formal beauty and considerable intellectual coherence, designed from first principles to disappear, leaving behind only what the fair's planners had always intended to leave behind: the one permanent building, the art museum on the hill, and the memory of everything else. At the western margin of the fairgrounds, past the colonnades of the main exhibition palaces, and beyond the Pike's half-mile of commercial entertainment, the Louisiana Purchase Exposition had laid out a section of its grounds that operated according to a different set of organizing principles than the rest of the fair. Where the main palaces used the classical architectural vocabulary of columns, pediments, and formal axial arrangement to communicate the ordered achievements of industrial civilization, the anthropological district at the fair's periphery was organized to communicate something else: the condition of peoples understood, within the scientific framework the exposition's planners had adopted, as representing civilization's prior stages. Its evolutionary prehistory made available for direct inspection by the citizens of a 20th century world that had, in this telling, already moved well beyond them. The district was not hidden or incidental to the fair's design. It was structural to the fair's argument about itself, and it was attended, through the exposition's 7-month run, by a very large portion of the 20 million visitors who came to Forest Park to see what American civilization looked like at the height of its self-confidence. The intellectual architecture of this section was the responsibility of William John McGee, who held the title of Chief of the Department of Anthropology for the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, and who had been selected for the role on the basis of his previous work at the Bureau of American Ethnology in Washington, where he had spent the better part of the 1890s engaged in ethnological fieldwork and theoretical classification. McGee had been born in Farley, Iowa, in 1853, and was largely self-educated. He had taught himself geology, hydrology, and anthropology with the methodical ambition of a generation of American scientists for whom institutional credentialing was less uniformly required than it would later become. By 1904, he had established himself as a significant figure in the organizational life of American science, serving as a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and contributing regularly to the publications of the National Geographic Society and the American Anthropological Association. He was a confident and systematic proponent of the evolutionary framework that dominated Anglo-American social science at the turn of the century. The framework derived in its broad outline from the work of Lewis Henry Morgan, who had organized human cultural history into 3 stages of savagery, barbarism, and civilization, and extended through the social Darwinist elaborations of Herbert Spencer into a structure that treated the developmental distance between those stages as measurable, demonstrable, and directly observable in the living peoples of the world's colonial territories. McGee embraced this framework not as a political position, but as a scientific one, and he designed the anthropological section of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition as a demonstration of that conviction made three-dimensional and available to public inspection. The practical consequence of McGee's organizing logic was that the Exposition Company, working through the State Department, the Bureau of Insular Affairs, and various private arrangements, spent the years 1902 and 1903 assembling in St. Louis a population of several thousand people from communities in the Philippines, the Congo Free State, Japan, the Arctic, and the American Southwest, who were to be housed in constructed approximations of their traditional living environments and observed by fairgoers throughout the exposition's operational period. For the largest single contingent, the approximately 1,100 Filipinos who were brought to the fair to populate the Philippine reservation, the arrangements were managed through the Bureau of Insular Affairs, the federal agency that had administered the Philippine Islands as a United States territory since the conclusion of the Philippine-American War. And the reservation itself covered approximately 47 acres at the southwestern end of fairgrounds, making it the largest single exhibit area outside the main exhibition district. The Philippine reservation had been constructed over the preceding year to include multiple distinct village environments, each representing a different ethnic or cultural group from the archipelago, and arranged spatially according to the evolutionary schema McGee's department had developed. The Visayan village, representing Christianized and, in the exposition's framing, partly Americanized Filipinos, was positioned nearest the main fairgrounds, while the Bontoc Igorot village was situated at the farthest remove, designated in the exposition's official materials as representing the most primitive of the Philippine peoples. The Bontoc Igorots, highland people from the Cordillera Central of northern Luzon, became the subject of more sustained press attention than any other single group at the fair, for reasons that had less to do with their actual cultural practices than with the appetite of the American popular press for material that could be presented as evidence of extreme cultural difference. The practice that generated the most coverage was the slaughter and consumption of dogs, a normal and culturally embedded feature of food culture in several highland Philippine communities, unremarkable within its own context and not meaningfully more or less rational than the American consumption of cattle or pigs, though the American press in 1904 showed no particular inclination to draw that comparison. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the St. Louis Globe-Democrat, and the St. Louis Republic all ran articles in the summer of 1904 describing the Igorot village with tones that ranged from elaborate horror to condescending fascination. And those articles drove visitor attendance to the Igorot section of the Philippine reservation in a way that the Bureau of Insular Affairs had not specifically planned for, but found difficult to object to, since the resulting coverage also served the political purpose of demonstrating to an American public still unresolved in its attitude toward Philippine annexation that the project of American colonial administration was a civilizing endeavor with a clear directional logic. The 1,100 Filipinos on the reservation lived in constructed village environments for the entirety of the exposition's run, earning wages negotiated by the Bureau, and set at rates that reflected the same cost-minimizing logic the exposition company applied to every other form of labor employed. The financial relationship between their presence and the fair's commercial revenue was not ambiguous, though it was not stated in those terms in any document the exposition company published. Among the several individuals from the Congo Free State who were brought to Louisiana Purchase Exposition by Samuel Phillips Verner, a South Carolina-born Presbyterian missionary who had conducted multiple expeditions to Central Africa, the man whose subsequent history would become most extensively documented was a young beauty man whose name, rendered in the English press of the period as Odabenga, represented a phonetic approximation of the name by which he was known in his own language. Verner had encountered Odabenga in the interior of the Congo Free State under circumstances at later accounts, including Verner's own, rendered in ways that are difficult to reconcile fully with one another. But what is clear from the documentary record is that Odabenga had survived a violent dispersal of his community, a dispersal connected to the rubber extraction operations that agents of King Leopold II's regime were conducting through the Congo Free State during this period, and that Verner had negotiated, through means inadequately documented, his passage to the United States as part of a group of Congolese men intended for exhibition at the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. Odabenga arrived in St. Louis in the summer of 1904 and was housed in the anthropological section of the fairgrounds, described in the exposition's promotional materials and the press coverage of his arrival in language that combined the conventions of colonial spectacle with the pseudo-scientific vocabulary McGee's department had established as the section's interpretive framework. His teeth, which had been filed to points in the beauty tradition as part of the practice with specific cultural meaning within his community, were cited repeatedly in newspaper descriptions as physical evidence of savagery. His stature, estimated in press accounts at approximately 4 feet 11 inches, was presented not as a biological characteristic of his specific community, but as a measure of evolutionary distance from the visiting public. He was, as closely as subsequent scholarship has established, approximately 23 years old. Goyle, known in the American press and popular culture as Geronimo, occupied a position among the people displayed in the anthropological district that was singular in its combination of celebrity and captivity. He was, in the summer of 1904, approximately 74 or 75 years old. The exact year of his birth in the territory of the American Southwest is not established with precision in any surviving document, but most historical estimates place it around 1829. And he had been held as a prisoner of war by the United States Army since a surrender in September of 1886, after more than a decade as the most sought military adversary in the history of American southwestern expansion. At the time of the exposition, he was confined to Fort Sill in the Indian Territory of what is now the state of Oklahoma, and his presence at the fair required a formal arrangement with the War Department, which agreed to transport him to St. Louis under military escort and permit his display in the anthropological section as a living representative of the Apache resistance that American military and political history had. By 1904, reclassified from an ongoing threat to A, concluded chapter, Geronimo was permitted to sit in a designated area and to sell to fairgoers photographs of himself at prices that varied by the size of print, as well as bows, arrows, and small objects he had produced himself, keeping the proceeds within limits established by the officers accompanying him. He reportedly sold everything he produced at approximately the rate he could produce it, and the income he earned, modest by any external standard, significant by the standards of a man who had no other civilian income source, represented one of the more straightforwardly commercial transactions at a fair that was otherwise distinguished by its tendency to frame its commercial arrangements in the language of education and civilizational progress. He made at least one formal request during the fair's run to meet with President Theodore Roosevelt, who was not present at the exposition. The request was declined without recorded explanation. The Ainu people from Hokkaido, the northernmost main island of Japan, were represented at the fair by a group whose presence had been arranged through channels involving both the Japanese government's Exhibition Commission and the Exposition's Department of Anthropology, and their placement within McGee's evolutionary hierarchy produced a diplomatic complication that the fair's organizers had not fully anticipated. Japan had, by 1904, established itself as a significant military and industrial power in ways that European and American observers had not yet fully recalibrated their frameworks to accommodate. The Russo-Japanese War, which had begun in February of that year with a Japanese naval strike on the Russian Pacific Fleet at Port Arthur, was demonstrating with mounting clarity that the assumptions of European strategic superiority in Asia were not well founded in military fact. The classification of any people associated with Japan as pre-civilizational sat uncomfortably against the political reality of a nation whose navy was, in that same season, demonstrating a technical and organizational competence that confounded the racial taxonomies McGee's department was simultaneously employing on the western edge of Forest Park. The Japanese government registered its concern through appropriate diplomatic channels, and the Ainu display was managed with somewhat greater circumspection than several of the other groups in the anthropological section, though it remained an exhibit organized around the same foundational premise. The voice in academic circles that most clearly articulated a challenge to the intellectual premises of McGee's section was Frederick Starr, a professor of anthropology at the University of Chicago who had spent more than a decade conducting field work among indigenous communities in Mexico and had developed, through that work, a methodological skepticism about the evolutionary frameworks that McGee and his contemporaries regarded as established science. Starr published and spoke publicly in 1904 to the effect that the premise of arranging human peoples in a demonstrable hierarchy of civilizational development was methodologically indefensible, that the evidence on which such hierarchies were constructed was unreliable, that the conditions of the World's Fair were wholly unsuited to the serious study of any community's actual way of life, and that the display of living human beings as entertainment for a paying public was, regardless of its scientific pretensions, a commercial transaction whose costs were borne entirely by the people on display, and whose benefits accrued entirely to the institution charging admission. Starr was not alone among American anthropologists in having reservations about the evolutionary framework. The discipline was in the early stages of the methodological transformation that Franz Boas's theoretical work on cultural relativism was beginning to advance in the academic literature. But Starr was among the most publicly direct of the critics, and his critique was expressed in terms accessible to audiences beyond the specialized journals of academic anthropology, which gave it a circulation that McGee's institutional position could not simply absorb without acknowledgement. McGee's response to criticism of this kind was characteristic of a man who had not encountered serious institutional challenge to his framework from within the scientific establishment that funded and legitimized his work. He maintained his position and continued to describe the anthropological section in his public addresses as an empirical demonstration of established evolutionary principles. The exhibits continued to draw substantial visitor traffic throughout the summer and autumn of 1904, and the anthropological district was identified in several newspaper surveys of fairgoer experience as among the most frequently visited sections of the entire grounds. The commercial contribution of these exhibits to the fair's gate revenue was considerable and measurable. The costs borne by the people whose presence generated that revenue were real and largely measurable, and they did not appear in the exposition company's financial accounts in any form that distinguished them from the revenue generated by the Palace of Transportation or the Cascades water feature. After the fair closed in December 1904, the dispersal of the people who had been brought to St. Louis as living exhibits followed paths whose documentation is, in most cases, incomplete. Many of the Filipinos from the Philippine Reservation returned to the Philippine Islands under arrangements managed by the Bureau of Insular Affairs. Samuel Phillips Verner returned Oda Benga to the Congo Free State in 1905, but the community to which Oda Benga had belonged had been dispersed by Belgian colonial operations, and the land where his villages stood was no longer accessible to him in any practical sense. Verner brought him back to the United States the following year, and in September of 1906, Oda Benga was placed in the primate house of the Bronx Zoological Park in New York, housed in an enclosure alongside orangutans and chimpanzees, with a placard identifying him as an exhibit. The response from New York's African-American community was immediate and precisely stated. A group of Black Baptist ministers, led by the Reverend James Herman Gordon of the Howard Colored Orphan Asylum in Brooklyn, formally protested to the zoo's director, William Temple Hornaday, and to New York's mayor, George Brinton McClellan, Jr., in terms that required no interpretive assistance. The display was a degradation of a human being and its continuation constituted an institutional declaration about the humanity of black people that no American institution of any description had the standing to make. Hornaday maintained, in his written response, that the exhibit served scientific and educational purposes, and that sentiment was being permitted to interfere with education. Oda Bengal was removed from the exhibit in late September 1906, placed in the care of a succession of institutions and individuals in New York, and subsequently in Lynchburg, Virginia, and lived the remaining decade of his life in that city. He died on the 20th of March, 1916, at approximately 32 years of age. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition's official history, published by the Exposition Company in 1905, described the Department of Anthropology and its living exhibits as among the fair's most significant intellectual contributions, a demonstration, conducted at unprecedented scale, of the range of human cultural development and the trajectory of its progress. The description was, within the terms the official history had established for itself, accurate. The exhibit had been seen by several million people, had been discussed extensively in the press of a dozen nations, and had communicated to a very large audience a coherent set of ideas about the relationship between civilization and the peoples it defined as its predecessors. The question of whether those ideas were founded in reliable evidence, or whether the methods by which they had been communicated were defensible under the scrutiny that the discipline of anthropology was, even in 1904, beginning to apply to its own assumptions, was not one that the official history of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition was organized to address. That kind of accounting would take considerably longer and would be conducted in rather different rooms. The third modern Olympic Games did not begin as a St. Louis enterprise. When the International Olympic Committee, meeting in Paris in 1901 under the chairmanship of Pierre de Freddy, Baron de Coubertin, awarded the third Games to an American city, the city selected was Chicago, which had submitted a formal bid backed by a committee of Illinois civic figures and which had been, in the IOC's assessment, the better organized candidate. The Games were scheduled for the summer of 1904, and the Chicago Organizing Committee had begun the preliminary work of site selection and event planning before a complication arose from the same civic competition that was shaping so much else in the relationship between the two cities. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition Company, in its planning meetings in St. Louis in 1901 and 1902, made it known through appropriate channels that St. Louis intended to organize an international athletic competition of its own during the World's Fair, and that this competition, drawing on the audience of what was expected to be the largest exposition in American history, would inevitably overshadow any simultaneous Olympic Games held in Chicago. The implicit message was received in Paris and in Chicago with clarity adequate to its purpose. In November of 1901, the International Olympic Committee transferred the Games from Chicago to St. Louis, where they would run concurrently with the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. The decision was a pragmatic one, taken under the specific pressure of American civic geography, and it set in motion a series of consequences for the character and quality of the Games themselves that the IOC's members could not have fully anticipated at the time they voted. James Edward Sullivan, who served as Secretary-Treasurer of the Amateur Athletic Union of the United States and who was appointed chief organizer of the St. Louis Olympic program, was a man of considerable energy and considerable conviction, whose ideas about athletic competition were shaped in ways he did not always articulate, but which are legible in his organizational decisions, by the same framework of racial and civilizational hierarchy that William John McGee was simultaneously applying to the anthropological exhibits a few hundred yards away across the fairgrounds. Sullivan had been born in New York City in 1860, had worked as a sports editor and publisher before joining the Amateur Athletic Union in the 1880s, and had built the organization into the dominant administrative body for amateur athletics in the United States. He was, by 1904, a figure of genuine authority in American sporting culture, and his appointment as the effective director of the Olympic program meant that the Games, from the outset, would be organized according to his priorities, which were nationalistic in emphasis, promotional in method, and only intermittently attentive to the internationalist ideals that Baron de Coubertin had articulated in his founding documents for the modern Olympic movement. The practical consequence of Sullivan's control of the program, combined with the logistical reality that St. Louis was, in 1904, Separated from the major European athletic nations by a sea crossing of several weeks and a transcontinental rail journey of several days, was that the international participation, which the Olympic Charter defined as central to the Games' purpose, was, in St. Louis, essentially absent. Of the 42 nations that received formal invitations to participate, 12 sent official competitors. The remaining 30 either declined explicitly, citing the cost and difficulty of travel, or failed to organize their response in time to meet the enrollment deadlines that Sullivan's office had established. The athletes who did travel to St. Louis from abroad, from Great Britain, from Germany, from Canada, from Hungary, from Cuba, from Greece, and from several other nations, were in most cases individual competitors or very small delegations, rather than the national teams of any significant scale, and they arrived in a city that had organized its stadium, its competition schedule, and its officiating infrastructure around the assumption that American athletes would constitute the overwhelming majority of participants. Approximately 80% of the athletes who competed in the 1904 Olympic program were citizens of the United States, a proportion that fundamentally altered the character of the events from international competition to domestic championship, and that produced a medal table so thoroughly dominated by American results that the table's column for foreign victories was, in a significant number of events, entirely empty. The track and field events, held in Francis Field on the grounds of Washington University in St. Louis during the weeks of late August and early September, were conducted in conditions that contemporary athletic standards would have classified as unsuitable for serious competition, but that Sullivan's organizing committee regarded as adequate within the norms of the era. The stadium had been constructed for the university's athletic program rather than for international competition, and its running track was composed of compacted clay and cinder that produced, in the dry heat of Missouri August, a dense and persistent dust that accumulated in the air at the level of the competitors' faces and settled in their lungs over the course of events. Several European competitors who had made the journey to St. Louis at considerable personal and financial expense found themselves competing on a surface and in atmospheric conditions that bore no resemblance to what they had trained on, against a field of American athletes who were competing on their home ground and had been preparing specifically for these conditions. Archie Hahn of the Milwaukee Athletic Club won the 60-meter dash, the 100-meter dash, and the 200-meter dash, becoming the only triple sprint gold medalist the Olympic program would produce. George Iser, an American gymnast who had lost his left leg in a railway accident as a youth and competed with a wooden prosthetic, won 6 medals across the gymnastic events, including 3 gold, a performance that was by any measure exceptional and that received, in the press coverage of the following days, considerably less attention than the marathon. The marathon was held on the 30th of August, 1904, and it remains the most thoroughly documented athletic disaster in the history of the modern Olympic Games, a distinction it has retained across a century and more since the race was run. The course covered approximately 24.5 miles of public road to the western countryside of St. Louis, beginning and ending at the stadium, and was organized under conditions that its organizers appear to have accepted as adequate without examining closely. The temperature on the day of the race reached approximately 32 degrees Celsius by midday, and the humidity that typically characterized St. Louis in the late summer months was present in full measure. The roads used for the course were unpaved, and the automobiles accompanying the competitors, carrying coaches, trainers, officials, and in several cases press correspondents, stirred the road surface into a continuous cloud of fine dust through which the 32 competitors were required to run for the better part of 3 hours. There was, along the entire 24.5-mile course, a single water station, positioned approximately 12 miles from the start and stocked with supply of water that the heat in the field of 32 runners had largely exhausted before the majority of the competitors reached it. The decision to provide one water station for a race of this distance, in this heat, appears in retrospect as a decision reached by a committee that had not seriously examined what it was deciding. The sequence of events that followed the race's start is documented in the dispatches that the St. Louis newspapers published the following morning and in the official report that James Edward Sullivan's committee produced in the weeks afterward. Frederick Lors, a bricklayer from the Mohawk Athletic Club of New York, crossed the finish line first and was greeted by the crowd in the stadium with a reception due to an Olympic champion, which he accepted with apparent comfort for the approximately 20 minutes it took for it to emerge that he had, following a severe episode of leg cramps 11 miles into the race. accepted a ride in one of the accompanying automobiles for approximately 11 miles before resuming running for the final portion of the course. Lors later stated that the entire sequence had been intended as a joke, a characterization that the Amateur Athletic Union received without visible amusement before suspending him from competition for a period of 12 months. Thomas Hicks, a British-born brass worker competing for the United States, crossed the finish line approximately 15 minutes after Lors in the official timing and was declared the winner, at which point his handlers disclosed, without apparent awareness, that disclosure would complicate their situation, that Hicks had been administered doses of strychnine sulfate mixed with raw egg whites and brandy twice during the race. The first dose administered at approximately the 12-mile mark and the second approximately 4 miles from the finish line. Strychnine, in very small quantities, was understood in 1904 athletic culture as a stimulant capable of extending endurance past its natural limits, and its administration to a competitor during a race was not technically prohibited under the rules the Amateur Athletic Union had published, because the Amateur Athletic Union had not yet found it necessary to address the specific situation of a coaching staff poisoning their athlete in controlled doses to produce performance. Hicks was photographed after crossing the finish line in a state of evident physical distress, was treated by physicians at the stadium, and recovered. He did not compete in another Olympic marathon. Felix Carvajal de Soto, a Cuban postal worker from the city of Havana, had reached St. Louis by a route that already, before the race began, demonstrated a quality of persistence that the race itself would only confirm. Having raised money for his passage to the United States through street performances in Havana, Carvajal had traveled to New Orleans, where he was robbed of his remaining funds by persons whose identity the subsequent record does not establish. He reached St. Louis by means of hitchhiking and generosity from strangers, arrived at the race registration with no training resources and no coaching support, and started the marathon in a pair of heavy street shoes and long trousers that a fellow competitor, the Irish-American discus thrower Martin Sheridan, helped him cut into rough shorts at the starting line. Carvajal ran the course while conversing with spectators along the route in Spanish, paused in an orchard approximately 2/3 of the way through the race to eat several apples that had fallen from the trees, a decision that introduced a gastrointestinal complication requiring a brief rest, and still finished in 4th place, which was, given the conditions under which he had traveled, prepared, equipped, and run, a performance of a different character than the 3 finishes that preceded it. A South African runner named Len Tonyane, a Tswana man who had come to St. Louis as a participant in the fair's Boer War exhibit and had registered for the marathon through channels that the official committee had not specifically anticipated, was running in a position that might have placed him significantly higher in the final standings when a dog belonging to a spectator on the course chased him off the road and across an open field, costing him approximately a mile of additional distance. He finished 9th. In the 2 weeks preceding the marathon, James Edward Sullivan had organized what he called the Anthropology Days, a 2-day athletic competition held on the 12th and 13th of August, 1904, in which men from the fair's anthropological exhibits were assembled at the stadium and invited to compete in a program of events drawn from the Olympic schedule, including sprints, distance running, the shot put, the standing high jump, and the pole climb. The stated purpose of the Anthropology Days, as Sullivan articulated it in his correspondence and in the official publications of the Amateur Athletic Union, was scientific, to determine, through direct empirical observation of athletic performance, whether the physical capacities of peoples classified as primitive were inferior, superior, or equivalent to those of the trained athletes who competed in the Olympic program. The experimental design had a flaw visible enough that the discipline of experimental science, even in 1904, had the conceptual tools to identify it. The participants from the anthropological exhibits had not trained for specific events on the program, had no familiarity with the specific techniques of shot putting or pole climbing as conducted in Western athletic culture, were competing under the supervision of officials whose organizational loyalty lay entirely with the opposite conclusion, and were being asked to perform for an audience that had paid to watch them in a context designed to produce a predetermined result. The results were tabulated. The tabulations were compared to performances of trained Olympic athletes, and the comparison was presented in Sullivan's subsequent report as evidence demonstrating that civilizational development was directly correlated with athletic capacity. Pierre de Coubertin, who had not attended the St. Louis Games and was following events from Europe through the dispatches of his representative, wrote afterward that the anthropology days constituted, in his view, a profound misunderstanding of what athletic competition was for, and that the decision to organize them in conjunction with the Olympic program had done damage to the principles the movement existed to advance. The specific phrase he used in his correspondence has been translated and paraphrased in various ways across the subsequent literature, but his judgment of the event was unambiguous in its direction. The broader athletic program of the 1904 Games was distributed across a period of approximately 5 months, which was itself a departure from the compressed format that the 1896 Athens Games and the 1900 Paris Games had established as the Olympic model. Events in rowing, swimming, gymnastics, fencing, shooting, cycling, and tennis were held at intervals throughout the exposition's operational period, spread across venues that included the artificial lake in the fairgrounds, the nearby Crève-Cœur Lake, and several club facilities in the St. Louis metropolitan area. Attendance at most events outside the track and field program was thin enough that the records kept by the organizing committee sometimes reflect more officials than spectators. The swimming events, held in an artificial lake whose water quality the summer heat had not improved, attracted complaint from competitors of several nations regarding the visibility and temperature of the water, complaints that went unaddressed because the organizing committee had no alternative venue and insufficient time or budget to develop one. The boxing program, newly added to the Olympic schedule in 1904, was held in a convention hall under conditions of organization that even the American sporting press, generally disposed to favor the enterprise, described as improvised. The 1904 Olympics produced a full schedule of events, a complete set of medal results, and a documentary record detailed enough for subsequent historians to reconstruct them in considerable specificity. What they did not produce was any serious claim to being the kind of international athletic gathering that the Olympic movement's founding documents had described as its purpose. The international dimension was absent not because the world had declined to participate in principle, but because the world could not practically reach St. Louis at the cost and in the time available, and because the American Organizing Committee had not regarded that practical impossibility as a problem requiring a solution. James Edward Sullivan filed a formal report with the Amateur Athletic Union following the game's conclusion, in which he described the athletic program as a success and presented the American medal dominance as a demonstration of the superior development of athletic culture in the United States. The report did not address the question of whether a competition in which 80% of the participants are citizens of the host country meets the definition of an international championship in any meaningful sense. The question was, in Sullivan's organizational framework, not one that required addressing, because the framework did not contain a category for its consideration. That particular intellectual limitation, the comfortable assumption that the organizing perspective was a universal one, that the measurement system and the thing being measured were separate from each other, was, by the summer of 1904 in St. Louis, a feature of the landscape rather than an anomaly in it. The mythological relationship between the Louisiana Purchase Exposition and American food culture was assembled gradually, in the decades following the fair's close, through a process that combined genuine historical connection with retrospective attribution and the natural human appetite for origin stories that are clean, dramatic, and attributable to a single moment. By the mid-20th century, a settled popular narrative had taken shape around the claim that the St. Louis World's Fair had introduced to the American public a set of foods: the ice cream cone, iced tea served over ice in a glass, spun sugar candy sold at a fair price, whose subsequent ubiquity in American consumer life made the moment of their introduction feel, in retrospect, like an event of cultural significance proportional to that ubiquity. The narrative was not false in all its particulars. It was, in several of its most important details, supported by contemporary documentation. But it was considerably more complicated than its popular form suggested, and the complications were, characteristically, located at the level of the commercial and industrial conditions that the mythology had no particular interest in examining. The summer of 1904 in St. Louis was, by the meteorological records kept at the United States Weather Bureau station in the city, one of the hottest in the preceding decade. July temperatures regularly exceeded 32 degrees Celsius during the afternoon hours, and the humidity that characterizes Missouri's continental climate, through the summer months, combined with those temperatures to produce sustained physical discomfort that affected the experience of every person on the fairgrounds from roughly 10 in the morning until the relative relief of the evening electrical display drew visitors back out of whatever shade they had found during the worst of the afternoon heat. The fairgrounds offered limited natural shade, since Forest Park's mature trees have been largely removed or inaccessible during the conversion of the site, and the staff buildings, which absorbed heat through their white surfaces and radiated back through their thin walls, provided interiors that were, in the middle hours of summer days, warmer than the open air. Visitors to the fair in July and August of 1904 were people who had traveled, in most cases, some distance to attend, who had paid their 50-cent admission at the gate, and who were operating in the heat with varying degrees of physical resilience and varying degrees of access to the liquid refreshment that the conditions required. The commercial infrastructure of the fairgrounds was attentive to the situation in the way that captive market conditions generally produce attentiveness. The vendors operating inside the gates understood that the heat was their ally, and they priced accordingly. Richard Blatchinden had come to the Louisiana Purchase Exposition as a commissioner representing the India Tea Association, the promotional organization that managed the marketing of tea grown in the Assam and Darjeeling regions of British India in the American market. Hot tea was, in 1904, an established presence in American domestic life, imported from India, Ceylon, and China, brewed in homes and served in hotel dining rooms across the country. But its market share relative to coffee was modest, and Blatchinden's mission at the fair was promotional, to increase American awareness of an affection for Indian tea by making available in sample form to fairgoers who might then develop a purchasing habit. The difficulty he encountered in July was not obscure. People standing in 32-degree heat in a humid fairground were not, in any measurable quantity, interested in drinking hot liquid. Blatchinden, faced with promotional failure of the most literal kind, adjusted his approach by pouring tea over ice in a glass, a preparation that, as subsequent historical investigation has established, was not invented at the 1904 fair, and was not unfamiliar to American consumers in the southern and southwestern states, where iced tea in various forms had been consumed since at least the 1880s. What Blatchinden contributed was not the invention of the preparation, but a large-scale promotional encounter between that preparation and fairgoers from across the United States who might not have encountered it in their own daily lives, and who were, in the heat of Missouri July, significantly more receptive to a cold glass of sweetened tea than they would have been to the hot variety. The subsequent growth of iced tea as a nationally consumed beverage in the United States cannot be attributed in any simple causal chain to the St. Louis Fair, but neither is a connection entirely fabricated. A promotional success of the kind Blatchinden experienced at an event attended by 20 million people from across the country created a point of mass cultural contact with a product that was, in many parts of the United States, genuinely unfamiliar. The attribution of the ice cream cone to the Louisiana Purchase Exposition is similarly textured. Multiple competing accounts of its origin were recorded within a decade of the fair's close, and several of them are mutually incompatible in their specific details, though most of them share the same general setting. The Pike, during a period of high attendance in the summer of 1904, at one of the several ice cream and pastry stalls operating in adjacent positions along the midway. The account that received the most sustained circulation identified Ernest Hamwi, a Syrian-born pastry maker who had immigrated to the United States before the fair, and who was operating a concession selling zalabia, a thin, crisp waffle pastry made from a batter of flour, water, and rose water, cooked on a hinged iron, as the person who first rolled his product into a conical form and offered it to an adjacent ice cream vendor named Arnold Forneshoe, who had exhausted the supply of dishes during a period of high demand and was in need of a vessel for his product that did not require retrieval and washing. A second account identified Charles Menches, an ice cream vendor from Ohio, as having made the same discovery independently at approximately the same time and under approximately the same circumstances. Additional accounts named further individuals. Ernest Lascaux, a waffle vendor, David Aviu, a concessionaire from New York, and Abe Dumar, a Syrian-born vendor who claimed to have demonstrated the rolled waffle cone to Hamwi rather than the other way around, all offered versions in which the central moment, the act of rolling a thin waffle into a cone and placing ice cream in it, was attributed to themselves or to a close associate. The proliferation of origin claimants is itself informative. It suggests that the preparation, whatever its specific moment of first occurrence, was discovered or adapted independently by multiple people working in similar conditions and facing similar operational problems simultaneously, which is a historical pattern for most practical innovations in commercial food service, and suggests a somewhat more prosaic origin than the mythology of single, inspired invention tends to accommodate. What contemporary documentation established beyond dispute was that the ice cream cone, in the specific form of commercially sold waffle cone containing a scoop of ice cream, became the subject of sustained public interest during the fair's run, and was associated in the press of the period with the St. Louis Exposition in terms clear enough to constitute a genuine cultural connection. The Missouri Republican reported on the waffle cone vendors along the pike as early as the summer of 1904. The subsequent commercial development of the ice cream cone as a nationally sold product, driven by manufacturers including the Cornucopia Waffle Company, which Hamwe founded in St. Louis shortly after the fair's close, was accelerated by the national visibility the fair had given the product, and the association between the fair and the cone was reinforced over the following decades by marketing communications from ice cream manufacturers who found the origin story commercially useful, regardless of its precise historical accuracy. William James Morrison, a Nashville dentist and amateur inventor, had developed in partnership with the candy maker John Clements Wharton a machine capable of melting sugar and forcing it through fine perforated discs spinning at high speed, producing threads of caramelized sugar so fine that they aggregated into a light, airy mass that dissolved almost immediately on contact with the moisture of the tongue. Morrison and Wharton had patented the essential mechanism of this machine in 1897 and had spent the intervening years attempting to find an effective commercial venue for product, which they were calling Fairy Floss, a name that communicated both its visual quality and its insubstantial nature with a precision that would have served the product well had the name persisted into later decades. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition provided them with the commercial venue they had been seeking. They sold their concession rights to operate the machine on the pike and spent the exposition's run producing and selling the product at 25 cents per box, a price that reflected both the novelty of the item and the captive market conditions of the fairgrounds, and that was, by their own subsequent account, enthusiastically met by fairgoers who had encountered nothing like it. The documented sales figures from the fair suggest that they sold approximately 68,000 boxes of the product across the exposition's run, a volume that established the commercial viability of the machine and of the product it made. The name Fairy Floss persisted in some markets for several decades before being largely replaced in American commercial usage by the term cotton candy, which described the product's visual resemblance with rather less poetic ambition, but rather more immediate recognizability. The commercial food environment of the fairgrounds was, by the heat of August, operating under conditions of physical stress that the exposition company's concessionaire agreements had not adequately anticipated. The central challenge was temperature. The same heat that had driven Blachindon to pour his tea over ice and that had made ice cream vendors among the most commercially successful operations on the grounds also created conditions in which the storage and preparation of food at the volume required to serve tens of thousands of visitors per day became a problem without clean solutions. The fairgrounds food preparation facilities were temporary in the same sense that everything else on the grounds was temporary, constructed for a season and not for kind of sustained operational hygiene that permanent restaurant kitchens developed over years of use. Ice for cold storage was available but expensive, and the concessionaire agreements the exposition company had negotiated were structured around a percentage of gross revenue rather than a flat fee, creating an incentive for vendors to maximize throughput at the expense of the kind of careful, slow food handling that the august temperatures required. The St. Louis Department of Health, whose inspectors were permitted access to the fairgrounds under an agreement with the exposition company, filed reports through the summer of 1904 describing conditions in several food preparation areas that fell below the standards of the department applied to restaurants operating permanently in the city, and a number of vendors received formal notices of deficiency that required corrections. They were in the compressed operational environment of a running exposition, not always able to implement completely before the next inspection. The gastrointestinal complaints recorded by the fair's medical stations in July and August of 1904 were not unusual in their individual presentation. The combination of heat, questionable food handling, and the physical exertion of walking several miles across a large outdoor exposition site in Missouri summer conditions produced predictable results among a portion of any large crowd. But their aggregate volume during the warmest weeks of the fair's run was sufficient to occupy the attention of the medical personnel the exposition company maintained on the grounds, and to generate correspondence between the medical stations and the health department that has been preserved in the records of the Missouri State Archives. The visitors affected were, in the majority, people for whom a day at the exposition represented a significant financial and logistical commitment. People who had traveled some distance, paid the gate admission, and spent money on food and entertainment inside the grounds, and who experienced the physical consequences of that expenditure in the discomfort of a fairground afternoon or the difficult hours of the following night. The exposition company did not publish data on medical station usage, and the press coverage of the fair in the summer of 1904 was not, as a general matter, disposed toward the reporting of stories that complicated the positive institutional narrative the fair had worked to establish. The medical records exist in the archives. They did not appear in promotional literature. The pricing structure of food inside the fairgrounds merits attention as a material fact about the experience the fair actually provided to visitors whose attendance its promotional materials had solicited. Lunch counter items priced at 15 cents inside the gates reflected the accumulated costs of the exposition company's concessionaire percentage, the premium charged for operating in a seasonal temporary facility, and the elementary commercial logic of a market from which customers could not depart in search of alternatives without forfeiting their admission. A working-class family from a St. Louis neighborhood who had budgeted carefully for an outing to the fair, saving the $2 for 2 adults and 2 children to enter, perhaps setting aside additional funds for 1 or 2 pike attractions, found that the food available inside the grounds consumed their remaining budget at a rate that bore no resemblance to what they paid for food in the neighborhood they had left that morning. The vendors operating outside the gates along de Balavier Avenue and the surrounding streets had understood this dynamic from the exposition's earliest operating weeks, and the informal economy of sandwich carts, fruit vendors, and lunch counters that established itself in the streets immediately adjacent to the fairgrounds provided an alternative for visitors who had already learned, or who had been advised by friends or family who had already learned, that eating before entering and carrying whatever provisions the gates would permit was a more economical approach to a full day on the fairgrounds than relying on what was sold inside. The foods that would be retrospectively connected to the Louisiana Purchase Exposition and incorporated into mythology of American culinary innovation were, in their actual presence at the fair, commercial products developed by vendors operating under the specific pressures of a temporary, high-volume, high-heat, captive market environment, with direct incentives to reduce costs and with regulatory oversight that was present but not consistently effective. The waffle cone was a practical solution to a dish shortage problem. The iced tea was a promotional adaptation to weather that had defeated the original promotional plan. The spun sugar candy was a patented machine in search of a commercial venue large enough to justify its operating costs. These are not origins without significance. The connections between the fair and the subsequent commercial careers of these products are real and documented. They are simply not the same story as the one in which American culinary creativity flowered, in the heat of a Missouri summer, into a set of gifts to the national palate. They are stories about vendors solving operational problems under commercial pressure, in a market designed to extract the maximum available revenue from a captive audience, in a heat that was indifferent to the promotional calendar the exposition company had published. The products were real. The conditions that produced them were somewhat less appetizing than the mythology preferred to record. The city of St. Louis that surrounded the Louisiana Purchase Exposition's fenced and ticketed grounds during the summer and autumn of 1904 was carrying, in several measurable respects, a set of structural burdens whose connection to the fair the promotional literature of the exposition company was not organized to acknowledge. The most immediately consequential of these was the condition of the municipal water supply. St. Louis drew its drinking water from the Mississippi River, an intake point approximately 2 miles north of the city's northern boundary, and filtration and purification systems available in 1904, slow sand filters operating at a scale that had been adequate, more or less, for the city's population of approximately 575,000 in the 1890s, were insufficient to process the volume of water the city's expanded needs and the fair's additional demands required without compromising the quality of what emerged from the taps. The typhoid fever death rate in St. Louis in the years immediately preceding the fair had been among the highest recorded for any major American city, a rate that reflected both the inadequacy of the filtration system and the contamination of the river above the intake point by agricultural and industrial runoff from the Missouri watershed. The Exposition Company had made no formal provision for connecting the fairgrounds to a separate water supply. The fair drew from the same municipal system that the city's own residents used, and the additional demand of 20 million visitors across 7 months, at concession stands, in sanitary facilities, filling the Cascades Reservoir, and supplying the fair's boilers and generators, was a demand placed on an infrastructure that had not been meaningfully upgraded to carry it. The construction of a new slow sand filtration plant at the Chain of Rock site north of the city, which would eventually bring St. Louis's typhoid mortality down to levels comparable to other American cities of similar size, was underway during the fair's operating period, but was not completed until 1905. In the interim, the Municipal Board of Health operated under conditions that required managing a known public health risk, with resources acknowledged by the board's own reports to the city's Board of Aldermen to be inadequate to the task. The board's annual reports for 1903 and 1904 recorded not only the continued elevation of the typhoid rate, but formal requests for additional appropriations to address it. Requests that the city's budget process, already committed to the substantial expenditure associated with the fair's demands on municipal roads, utilities, and transit, was unable to fully accommodate. The fair and the typhoid problem existed simultaneously in the same fiscal year, drawing on the same pool of municipal resources, and the priority that an international exposition received over an ongoing public health crisis was not a priority anyone at the Exposition Company stated openly, but it was a priority the budget reflected with considerable clarity. The residents who bore the cost of this arrangement were distributed across the city in the pattern that waterborne disease has always favored, concentrated in the wards with the highest housing density, the oldest plumbing, and the fewest economic alternatives to municipal water supply. The wards in the city's central and northern sections, where the density of housing was highest and the economic condition of residents left the least room for the purchase of alternatives, recorded typhoid mortality throughout the fair period that was substantially elevated above the rates in the western and southern portions of the city, where the commercial and professional classes were more heavily concentrated. This was the pattern of waterborne disease mortality in every American city whose water infrastructure had not yet been brought to the standard that the progressive public health movement of the early 20th century was establishing as achievable. It was also, in the specific context of 1904 St. Louis, a pattern intensified by the fair's presence, and one that the fair's promotional narrative of American civilizational progress had no category to accommodate. The situation of black St. Louis residents in relation to the Louisiana Purchase Exposition was shaped by a more comprehensive and systematic exclusion than the one affecting any other identifiable group of the city's population. African Americans constituted approximately 35,000 of St. Louis's 575,000 residents in 1904, concentrated primarily in neighborhoods in the central and near north portions of the city under conditions of housing density and economic constraint produced by the employment discrimination and residential segregation that were structural features of urban black life in the United States in this period. The Exposition Company's planning committees, which were constituted entirely of white men, had addressed the question of black American participation in the fair through a series of discussions whose practical outcome was the establishment of a nominal role, a limited representation in the educational and agriculture exhibit categories most closely associated in the minds of the fair's white organizers with the form of African American progress they were prepared to acknowledge, and the effective exclusion of black St. Louis residents from the employment, vendor, and concessionaire opportunities the fair generated for the city's working population. Booker Taliaferro Washington, who was in 1900 for the most prominent African-American public figure in the United States, and whose Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute in Alabama had made him, in the minds of many white American civic leaders, the representative voice of black American aspiration, had engaged and sustained correspondence with the Exposition Company's leadership about the representation of African American achievement at the fair. Washington's approach to such negotiations was shaped by the accommodationist philosophy he had been advancing since at least his Atlanta address of 1895, in which he proposed that black and white Americans might pursue their economic interests in parallel rather than in political confrontation with each other, a position that had earned him the respect of the white institutional establishment and the reservations of a growing number of African American intellectuals and activists who understood its limitations in ways its author acknowledged privately, but rarely stated in the forums where his voice carried the most weight. In his correspondence with the Exposition Company, Washington proposed the establishment of a dedicated exhibition space for African American achievement, a Negro building modeled on similar structures at previous American expositions, in which the educational, agricultural, and industrial accomplishments of black communities across the South could be displayed alongside the exhibits of the participating states and nations. The proposal was received, considered, and declined in the form Washington had advanced it. The fair's organizational and physical plan was, by the time Washington's letters arrived, too far advanced to accommodate the kind of dedicated space and allocated resources that a genuine representation would have required. What emerged instead was a modest representation of African American educational achievement within the broader galleries of the Palace of Liberal Arts, documented, present in the official record, and systematically dwarfed by the surrounding material in ways that made its presence feel more like evidence of inclusion than an actual instance of it. Nathan Benjamin Young, who served as president of Lincoln Institute in Jefferson City, Missouri, the historically black institution established after the Civil War by African American soldiers of the 62nd and 65th United States Colored Infantry Regiments, and which would later develop into Lincoln University, was among the most consistent and precisely articulate advocates for substantive black American participation in the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. Young's position at the head of Missouri's most significant African American educational institution gave him both a platform and a direct institutional stake in the decisions the Exposition Company was making, and his correspondence with the company and with the state government through 1902 and 1903 press, specifically for the practical measures that would have converted the fair's rhetorical commitment to universal progress into material benefit for the African American residents of the host city. Black employment in construction supervisory and skilled trades positions, black vendor contracts on the pike, a dedicated exhibition space with resources proportional to the achievement it was meant to represent. The responses Young received were cordial in their form and negligible in their practical content. The construction workforce at its peak employed African American laborers in the least skilled and least compensated categories, in proportions reflecting their representation in St. Louis's general labor market, while excluding them from supervisory, skilled trades, and administrative positions whose wages and working conditions were of a different character. Vendor and concessionaire contracts on the pike went, with negligible exceptions, to white commercial operators. The 7 months of the fair's operation generated measurable commercial income for St. Louis's white commercial class and largely failed to generate equivalent income for its black commercial class, a disparity that did not reflect the distribution of commercial ambition or capacity in the city, but the distribution of access that the fair's organizational decisions had produced. The labor disputes that followed the construction period were characterized by the diffuse quality that defines the grievance processes of workers assembled for a defined temporary project, rather than employed continuously at a permanent industrial site. Isaac Taylor, as chief of construction, had managed the Exposition's building program under sustained financial pressure from the Exposition Company's board, which was itself operating under the awareness that the original budget had been exceeded and that every dollar added to construction costs narrowed the margin available for the return on investment that Francis and his board had committed to pursuing. The compression of wages toward the lowest defensible market rate was a systematic feature of Taylor's management rather than an incidental one, and the disputes that arose from it, workers whose verbal wage commitments had not been reflected in their actual payments, overtime calculated at rates the workers contested, deductions applied for materials or tools whose costs the workers had not understood themselves to bear, generated a volume of individual complaints to the building trades Council of St. Louis and to the relevant union bodies adequate to occupy their grievance processes for the better part of 2 years following the fair's close. The individual workers who filed those complaints received settlements that were, in the majority of cases, partially satisfactory, or entirely unsatisfactory, and the records of those settlements have not survived in forms that permit their aggregate effect to be calculated with precision. They survive instead in the kind of institutional silence that descends on grievances too individually small to warrant sustained attention, and too structurally significant to be addressed without acknowledging what they reveal. Joseph William Folk, who had served as circuit attorney of the city of St. Louis before his election as governor of Missouri in November of 1904, occupied a position in the political history of the fair period defined less by direct involvement in the exposition's organization than by the investigations he had conducted into the municipal corruption surrounding the awarding of contracts and franchises in St. Louis in the years immediately before and during the fairs. Construction. Folk had come to the circuit attorney's office in 1901 with a political background that had not prepared observers to expect the methodical prosecution of the city's bipartisan networks of commercial corruption that he undertook beginning in 1902. The investigations he led resulted in the prosecution and conviction of several members of the city's House of Delegates, the lower chamber of St. Louis's municipal government, for accepting bribes in connection with the awarding of street railway franchises and other municipal contracts. And they produce a documentary record of the commercial relationships between the city's business community and its elected officials that journalist Lincoln Steffens drew on extensively for his assessment of St. Louis in the essays he was gathering into the Shame of the Cities, which appeared in book form in 1904. Steffens described St. Louis in that volume as a city that had disgraced not merely itself, but the United States through the systemic conversion of public assets and franchises into private commercial advantage. And while the exposition company's internal contracting practices were not the primary subject of his investigation, the organizational environment his reporting described was recognizably continuous with the environment within which the fair's commercial arrangements had been conducted. The financial accounts of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, as presented by the Exposition Company to its stockholders in the months following the fair's close, reflected the outcome of an enterprise that had cost substantially more to execute than it had generated in revenue. The operating revenues of the fair, from gate admissions, concessionaire percentages, exhibit fees, and the various commercial arrangements the company had entered into across its 7 months of operation, fell short of covering total operating expenses by a margin the company's final accounting placed at approximately $594,000, representing the net operating deficit after all revenues had been applied against all expenditures. The stockholders who had contributed to the private subscription campaigns of 1900-1901 receive a return on their investment that was, in all cases, substantially less than the face value of the stock they had purchased, and in most cases amounted to a near total loss of the subscribed capital. The $5 million municipal bond issue, approved by the city of St. Louis as its contribution to the exposition, was serviced through the city's general revenues in the years following the fair's close, a commitment that translated, for the city's taxpayers, into an ongoing financial obligation whose effect on the city's capacity to fund its other needs was real, sustained, and largely invisible in the public discourse surrounding the fair's legacy. The demolition of the temporary structures began within weeks of the fair's close in December of 1904 and was essentially complete by the spring of 1906. Steel framing members, timber lath, and usable lumber were recovered for their commercial value, and the contractors engaged with the demolition work organized themselves around that recovery rather than around any preservation consideration. The Palace of Fine Arts, designed by Cass Gilbert in permanent materials for precisely this aftermath, survived the demolition program intact and was transferred to the city as the St. Louis Art Museum, opening to the public in 1907 with the collections that Halsey Cooley Ives's department had assembled during the fair's planning years. The Smithsonian Institution's Flight Cage, a large wire-enclosed aviary that had housed a substantial bird collection during the fair's operation, was incorporated into the nucleus of what would become the St. Louis Zoological Park, formally established by the city in 1910 with the flight cage and portions of the fair's animal exhibit collection as its founding material. The landscape of Forest Park was returned to public use across 1905 and 1906, the grading and drainage work of the construction period having altered the park's original topography in ways that required additional municipal investment to restore to a condition suitable for civilian use. In 1913, a permanent building was completed in Forest Park to house the historical records and artifacts of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition itself, a memorial to the fair, designed in the Beaux-Arts manner that would eventually become the Missouri History Museum, and that stands today as one of the more literal examples of an institution built to house the memory of something that no longer physically exists. The city that emerged from the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in the years following 1904 was one in which the most durable consequences of the event were distributed with an exactness that the fair's promotional literature had not anticipated, and that its organizers, in their subsequent public accounts, did not consistently acknowledge. The St. Louis Art Museum occupied the hill where the Palace of Fine Arts had always been designed to stand. The commercial operators who had held profitable pike concessions had collected their percentages and dissolved their seasonal arrangements. The stockholders who had invested in the exposition company had recorded their losses and moved their capital elsewhere. The construction workers who had built the palaces had spent their wages, filed or not filed their disputes, and moved to whatever work was next available. The residents of the neighborhood surrounding Forest Park found themselves returning to a park that had been physically transformed by the fair's construction and returned to them with the quality of thing that had been used intensively for other purposes, and then handed back without full accounting for what the use had. Co-saint the typhoid filtration plant at Chain of Rocks was completed in 1905, and the city's waterborne disease. Mortality began in the years that followed. Its long descent toward the levels that comparable cities had already achieved. The black residents of St. Louis, who had been excluded from the fair's employment and commercial opportunities, continued, after the gates opened and the last staff building came down, to occupy the neighborhoods and the economic positions they had held before the fair arrived, without the accumulation of commercial capital or professional connection that 7 months of a 20 million visitor event might, under different organizational decisions, have provided to the community in whose city it had been staged. The gap between the cost of a thing and its official history is not always apparent immediately. In the case of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, that gap was wide enough that its official history and its actual history could share the same city, the same year, and the same set of events without quite inhabiting the same moral accounting, a condition that was not unique to this fair or to this city or to this moment in American history, but that the particular scale and ambition of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition had made unusually legible for those inclined to look. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition closed on the 1st of December, 1904, on a night cold enough to thin the crowds along the esplanade, and the electrical display that had marked each evening of the fair's 7-month run was lit for the last time over grounds that would spend the following 18 months being methodically dismantled. The demolition of the staff buildings proceeded inward from the fair's margins toward its center, the crews recovering what its salvage value and leaving the rest to be cleared by other means. The final accounts, when settled in full, reflected a net operating deficit of approximately $594,000, a contained figure against the scale of the enterprise overall, though one whose existence confirmed what the original budget structure had made probable from the first planning meetings in 1900. What remained when the work was finished was what had always been designed to remain: the Palace of Fine Arts in Cass Gilbert's permanent stone, which became the St. Louis Art Museum, the aviary that became the nucleus of the St. Louis Zoological Park, and Forest Park itself returned to the city's residents after a 7-month interruption, its topography permanently altered by the construction years. The fair had argued, through its architecture and the arrangement of its peoples, that progress was visible, measurable, and available for direct confirmation by anyone willing to pay 50 cents at the gate. The argument had been assembled at cost distributed unevenly across a city and its population, borne by workers, by the communities whose presence populated the exhibits, and by a municipal infrastructure stretched to serve a spectacle it had not been built to accommodate. What the Louisiana Purchase Exposition left behind, beyond the museum and the zoo and the altar park, was a legible record of a genuine belief, sincerely held and expensively executed, in a version of civilization that the evidence available to its organizers, had they examined it with equal care, would not have fully supported, and the distance between that belief and that evidence is the most informative thing the fair left behind, more durable in its way than even the stone building on the hill. Writing a script like this one sits in a particular tension. The format demands calm and measured narration, which means you can never quite lean into the moral weight that some of this material would, in a different context, openly deserve. So I want to use this space to say a few things more plainly. The section I feel most confident about is a human zoo. not because it covers difficult material. Plenty of scripts cover difficult material and do it badly, but because it refuses to use Otobenga as a symbol. He is in this script as a person with a specific age, a specific community, and a specific subsequent history that is followed all the way to Lynchburg, Virginia in 1916. That follow-through matters enormously. It is the difference between using someone's story and actually telling it, and it is the part of this script I would defend most firmly if pushed. The Olympics section does something I genuinely enjoyed building. It treats the anthropology days and the marathon as the same story, because they functionally were. Both were measurement systems designed in advance to confirm a result that had already been decided. Keeping them in the same section rather than presenting them as separate historical curiosities gives the analytical thread somewhere specific and satisfying to land. The food section is the one I would return to with more time. It is accurate. The demythologizing the ice cream cone origin story is built directly from what the documentary record supports, but it carries less analytical weight than the section surrounding it. That is partly the material's nature and partly a craft limitation. I chose to anchor it in the commercial and sanitary conditions of fair food rather than reach for a significance the material does not quite sustain at greater depth. Whether that was the right call, I am still genuinely working out. The recurring thread about hidden social costs, who built the fair, who was excluded from its proceeds, who absorbed the costs that the promotional literature had no category to record, is the element I think distinguishes the script most clearly from the standard documentary treatment of 1904, which tend to celebrate the spectacle and mention the human exhibits as a troubling footnote. Here, that cost is structural to the script rather than incidental to it. Tracking it across 6 sections without letting it tip into polemic was the central craft challenge of the whole project, and I think it holds. One honest note. A script of this length will always have sections that carry different weight, and that is not necessarily a failure. The architecture section and the food section are lighter than the human zoo and the Olympics, and I think appropriate variation in what a 100-minute narration asks its listeners to carry as a feature, not a flaw. What matters is that the thread is present throughout, and that the closing does not reach for a significance the preceding pages have not already earned. I think this one earns it. There are things in the script I am proud of, and one section I know I could have pushed further. That feels like an honest accounting. If you found yourself somewhere different while listening, if a section landed harder than expected, or if something felt unresolved, put it in the comments. The best version of this kind of work gets there through that kind of conversation, and I mean that without any of the usual politeness that phrase tends to carry.